The conference room smelled like old coffee and someone's nervous sweat, and I sat at the far end of the mahogany table with my hands folded in my lap, watching my brother arrange his papers like he was about to present a PowerPoint on why I deserved nothing. I did not look at him. I looked at the window behind him, at the gray November sky over downtown Cincinnati, and I kept my breathing even. His name was on the door of the firm where we were sitting. Not his firm, our grandfather's firm, the one my brother had maneuvered himself into after Dad died, the one he'd spent the last 8 months turning into his personal weapon. The nameplate outside said Whitfield and Associates, and the Associates part was a formality. There was only one person who mattered in that room, and he'd made sure I understood that before I even sat down. I'd driven 4 hours for this meeting. He'd sent a car service to pick up his fiancée from the airport. The estate attorney, a thin man named Mr. Bixby Pruitt, who had the energy of someone who genuinely wished he were anywhere else, cleared his throat and opened a folder. "As you both know," he said, "your mother's estate has been under review since her passing in March. The primary dispute concerns the investment accounts, specifically the $340,000 that was transferred out of the joint account your mother held with her eldest child in the 14 months before her death." My brother leaned forward. He had our father's jaw and our mother's temper, and he'd inherited the worst parts of both. "Transferred," he said, putting the word in air quotes with his fingers. "That's a polite way to say it." Mr. Pruitt looked at his folder. "Daniel." I said his name quietly. Just his name quietly. Just his name. Nothing else. He turned to me with that look he'd been perfecting since we were kids. The one that said, "You have always been the problem in this family." "You had access to her accounts," he said. "You were the one flying in every few months, staying for a week, leaving. Mom never questioned anything because she trusted you. And while she was sick and confused and grieving Dad, you cleaned her out." The woman sitting next to him, his fiancée Brooke, who had never liked me and made no effort to pretend otherwise, put her hand on his arm like he needed steadying. She was wearing a blouse that cost more than my first car. I knew because my mother had pointed it out to me 2 Christmases ago, with the particular tone she reserved for things she found tacky, but would never say directly. I missed my mother with a sharpness that sometimes felt physical, like something pressing against my sternum from the inside. "The transfers were authorized," I said. "By who?" "By you. You were her power of attorney. You authorized yourself." He slid a printed spreadsheet across the table. 14 transfers. 14 months, some of them in the middle of the night. Mr. Pruitt looked like he was considering faking a medical emergency. I looked at the spreadsheet. I had looked at it many times before, in many different contexts. I knew every line on it. "Are you finished?" I asked. "No." My brother straightened his jacket. "I filed a formal complaint with the probate court. We're moving to have you removed as executor and to compel a full accounting of where that money went. My attorney." He gestured to a man in the corner I'd barely registered, someone young and sharp-looking with a yellow legal pad. "Believes we have strong grounds for a civil claim of financial elder abuse." The young attorney nodded, like he was being filmed. Financial elder abuse. The word sat in the room like something dropped from a height. I looked at my brother. I thought about the year our mother was diagnosed, when I had flown home 6 times. I thought about the nights I'd sat with her while she couldn't sleep, when she talked about her garden and about the trip to Portugal she and our father had taken before everything went wrong, when she'd made me promise things that I kept even when they cost me. I thought about the Sunday afternoons I'd helped her sort through Dad's clothes, box by box, and how she'd held his flannel shirt to her face and breathed in, and then carefully folded it and set it aside like something precious. My brother had come home for Thanksgiving and 2 Christmases. He sent flowers on her birthday. He had her old phone number saved under Mom in his contacts. He told me that once at the funeral, like it meant something. "Okay," I said. He blinked. "Okay, let's go to court." The probate hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in February, at the Hamilton County Courthouse on Main Street. I wore the charcoal blazer I'd bought for a conference in D.C. 2 years before, the one my supervisor had told me looked appropriately severe. I thought about that as I buttoned it in the mirror of my hotel room at 6 in the morning. My brother had hired a litigator named Mr. Holt, who apparently had a reputation in Cincinnati estate law. I knew this because 3 separate people had texted me variations of, "Are you sure you don't want to settle?" after they found out who was representing him. I had my own attorney, a woman named Ms. Chen, who wore her reading glasses on a beaded chain and had the quiet, unhurried energy of someone who had never lost a case she cared about winning. She'd reviewed everything I gave her and said, "This is interesting," in a tone that told me nothing and everything. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood paneling, fluorescent lights, the smell of old paper and whatever someone had eaten for breakfast nearby. My brother sat at the plaintiff's table with Mr. Tom Holt and Brooke in the gallery behind him, her silk blouse exchanged for something that read more concerned family member than real housewife. I sat next to Miss Chen and watched the clerk arrange papers and did not look at my brother. The judge came in and everyone stood. Her name was on the placard on her bench, the Honorable Sandra Okafor. She was in her late 50s, maybe early 60s, with reading glasses and short natural hair going silver at the temples. And she moved through the room with the efficiency of someone who did not have patience for theater. My brother's attorney went first. He was good. I'll give him that. He laid out the transfers in chronological order, highlighted the ones that happened after 2 a.m., pointed out that my mother had been on a significant medication regimen in the final year of her life, and used the phrase, "taking advantage of a vulnerable woman" 3 times in 15 minutes. He called my brother as his first witness. My brother testified that our mother had called him in the spring before she died, confused and upset, asking where her money was going. That she told him she didn't understand the statements her bank was sending, that she'd asked if I was in some kind of trouble. He said this last part with his voice catching just slightly. Brooke dabbed at her eye. I kept my hands flat on the table. Then Mr. Holt called a neighbor, an older woman who lived 2 doors down from our childhood home, who testified that she'd seen me coming and going at odd hours during my visits and that my mother had seemed confused and sometimes frightened. Then he called a family friend who said my mother had seemed unlike herself in her last year. Then he introduced the spreadsheet as Exhibit A. Then he looked at me like the next part was going to be his favorite. "Ms. Whitfield," he said, "you've described yourself as a federal contractor. Can you explain to this court exactly what that means? What agency you work for? What your salary is? What your job title is?" I looked at Miss Chen. She nodded slightly. "I work in analysis," I said. "Analysis." He repeated it the way my brother had repeated transferred. "That's quite vague. You understand we're trying to establish your financial motive here. If you were struggling financially, that would be relevant. So, pay stubs, tax returns, W-2s, anything that establishes your income and employment over the last several years." Miss Chen stood. "Your Honor, my client's employment is subject to federal non-disclosure requirements. We've addressed this in our pre-hearing filing." "I'm aware," said Judge Okafor. She looked at me over her glasses. "Ms. Whitfield, I'm going to ask you directly. Are you currently employed?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you're unable to discuss the nature of that employment?" "Largely, yes. But I provided documentation to the court under seal." Mr. Holt spread his hands. "Your Honor, this is a convenient shelter. The plaintiff's position is that this claimed federal employment is being used to obscure financial irregularities. We'd ask that the court compel disclosure." Judge Okafor looked at him. Then she looked at Ms. Chen. Then she looked down at the folder in front of her, the one that had arrived by courier from a federal district office in Virginia 3 days before the hearing. Something shifted in her face. It was small. It was barely anything. But I saw it. "We'll take a brief recess," she said. The recess lasted 22 minutes. I know because I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom on a wooden bench and watched the clock on the wall. Miss Chen sat next to me with her reading glasses up on her forehead and her phone face down in her lap. "Are you doing okay?" she asked. "I'm fine." "You don't have to be fine." I thought about that. "I'm not fine," I said. "But I'm not fine either. I'm just waiting." She nodded like that made sense, and I was grateful she didn't try to fill the silence. Through the courtroom door, I could hear muffled voices. At some point, I heard my brother's voice rise and then drop. Brooke came out at the 15-minute mark, walked past me without looking at me, and went to the women's restroom. She came back 2 minutes later, also without looking at me. Her eye makeup was perfect. When we went back in, Judge Okafor was already at the bench. She'd taken off her reading glasses. "Mr. Holt," she said, "before we continue, I want to address the documentation submitted under seal in this case. I've reviewed it in chambers." She paused. "I'm also going to disclose, for the record, that I have professional familiarity with the agency referenced in those documents. I served on a federal judicial oversight committee that worked with this agency between 2014 and 2019. That context is relevant to my assessment of the materials." My brother leaned over and said something to Mr. Holt. Mr. Holt's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "The documentation establishes," Judge Okafor continued, "that Ms. Whitfield has been continuously employed at a senior level by a federal agency for the past 11 years. Her compensation during that period has been consistent and substantial, well above the amounts in dispute here. The transfers from the joint account were, according to accompanying records and correspondence between Ms. Stratis, Whitfield and her mother, authorized expenditures for her mother's medical care, home modifications, and a private nursing arrangement that was not covered by insurance." She set the folder down. "The suggestion that Ms. K2, Whitfield had financial motive to misappropriate her mother's funds is not supported by any evidence in this record. In fact, the evidence suggests the opposite, that Miss Whitfield was supplementing her mother's care from her own resources, not drawing from them." The courtroom was very quiet. I looked at the window above the jury box. There was no jury. This was probate court, but I looked at the window and watched a pigeon land on the ledge outside and then leave again. "Furthermore," Judge Okafor said, "I want to note that the medication records and cognitive assessments submitted by the plaintiff, intended to suggest the decedent was impaired and susceptible to manipulation, are contradicted by her own treating physician's notes from the same period, which the defense submitted as Exhibit F. Dr. Navarro's notes indicate that Mrs. Whitfield was, quote, cognitively intact, highly engaged with her care decisions, and consistently expressed confidence in her daughter's management of her affairs." She looked at my brother. He was very still. "The court finds in favor of the defense on all claims," she said. "The complaint is dismissed. Executor status remains with Ms. Whitfield." Mr. Holt, "I'd encourage you to have a conversation with your client about the standards for filing elder abuse claims in this state, as this case came close to the line for a bad faith filing." Mr. Holt said, "Understood, Your Honor," in a voice that had lost about 40% of its earlier confidence. Judge Okafor picked up her gavel, set it down gently. She didn't bang it, I noticed. She just set it down like she was setting down a pen. And the clerk said, "All rise," and she walked out. And that was it. My brother caught up with me on the courthouse steps. I was buttoning my coat against the February cold, and Miss Chen was a few steps ahead of me, already on her phone, and I heard his footsteps and knew before I turned around. "What was in that folder?" he said. It wasn't a question. "You heard what the judge said. I want to know what it said." I looked at him. He was wearing the same jacket he'd worn to our father's funeral, and I'd always thought that was either a coincidence or a statement, and I'd never asked which. "You know I can't tell you that," I said, "because it's classified." He said it the way people say things they find absurd. "Because it's classified." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. All these years, you let Mom think. You let her tell people you were doing something vague with data somewhere. You let her be embarrassed when people asked what her daughter did." I thought about my mother, about the way she'd held my face in her hands the last time I visited, when she was still strong enough to do that, and said, "I know you can't tell me, but I know it matters." About the way she'd squeezed my hand and said, "I've always known." She wasn't embarrassed, I said. She was proud. She just couldn't say why. My brother looked at me for a long moment, The February wind came down Main Street and moved the lapel of his jacket. "I thought you were stealing from her," he said, and his voice was different then. Not the voice from the conference room, not the voice from the courtroom. Smaller. More like the voice I remembered from when we were kids, when he used to come into my room during thunderstorms. Because he was scared but would never admit it. "I know you did," I said. "She never told me. She never. She was protecting you," I said. "She knew you'd worry. She knew you'd push to be involved, and it would put you in a difficult position. So she let you think what you thought." He was quiet for a minute. Behind him, Brooke stood on the sidewalk with her arms crossed, watching us. "I was so sure," he said. "I know. I filed a complaint," I said. He stopped. "The elder abuse thing. That was." "Yes," I said. "It was." He ran a hand over his face. He looked suddenly very tired. I thought about what it would feel like to say "I forgive you," and I found that I couldn't say it yet. Maybe not for a long time. Maybe someday in a different city, over coffee. When enough of this had worn down to something we could both look at without flinching. But not on the steps of the courthouse in February, not 20 minutes after he'd stood in front of a judge and called me a thief who preyed on her dying mother. "I need to go," I said. "Miss Chen has paperwork." "Right," he nodded. "Right." He nodded. "Right." I started down the steps. I was almost to the sidewalk when he said my name. Not "hey" or "wait," but my actual name, the way he used to say it when we were young. I turned around. "She talked about you," he said. "All the time. She'd tell the neighbors. My daughter works for the government. Very important work. I can't say more than that. She'd say it like..." He stopped again. "Like she was showing them something valuable." I held on to that for a second. Filed it somewhere I could find it later. "Yeah," I said. "I know." I sat in my rental car in the parking garage for a while before I drove anywhere. Not because I was upset. Not because I was about to cry. Just because I needed a moment that was mine. With no one looking at me. Where I didn't have to hold my face in any particular shape. The outcome was never really in doubt. I'd known that. The documents were what they were. Judge Okafor was the kind of judge who reads everything before she walks into a room, and the federal filing had made it clear enough. But knowing something will probably be fine and watching it actually be fine are two different experiences, and I had not understood that until I was sitting in a parking garage in Cincinnati smelling like courthouse air and stale coffee, with my coat still buttoned and my hands wrapped around the steering wheel. My mother had known what I did, not the specifics. I had never given her the specifics, but the shape of it. She'd understood that the work was real, and that the vagueness was not laziness or mystery for its own sake but necessity. And she'd never asked me to explain. She'd just held it alongside everything she did know about me, and decided it was enough. That, more than the ruling, was what was making it hard to breathe in the parking garage. On my phone there was a text from a colleague. Heard it went the way it should. Good. That was it. 3 words and a period. I worked with people who were not effusive, and I had come to find that quality almost moving. The discipline of saying the essential thing and leaving space around it. I texted back, "Yes, heading back tomorrow." Then I sat for another minute and looked at the concrete wall in front of me, which had nothing to offer, but was at least honest about it. My brother would probably call eventually, maybe after the paperwork was settled. Maybe after Brooke convinced him it was the mature thing to do. Maybe after a few months of sitting with what he'd done had softened it into something he could apologize for, without it costing him too much. I didn't know if I'd pick up. I didn't know what I'd say if I did. Some bridges need rebuilding from the foundation. You can't just patch the boards and call it safe. But I thought about him on those courthouse steps. The voice from the thunderstorms. The way he'd said our mother had talked about me to the neighbors, with something in his face that was not quite regret but was close to it. The recognition, maybe, of something he'd missed while he was looking somewhere else. That didn't fix anything. But it was something. I started the car. The dashboard lit up. On the passenger seat was the folder Ms. Chen had handed me outside the courthouse, the one with the certified copies of the court's ruling, the executor confirmation, the dismissal. My name on every page. I pulled out of the parking garage into the February gray of downtown Cincinnati, and I thought about calling my mother to tell her it was over. And I thought about how that would never not be the first thing I reached for, and I drove toward the highway with the heating on full and the radio off, and let the city give way to the flat brown fields of southern Ohio, and I just drove. There's a pen I keep on my lapel sometimes, when I'm not working. Small. Silver. A stylized feather. The kind of thing that looks like jewelry if you don't know what you're looking at. I don't wear it to be recognized. Most people who would recognize it are the people I work with, and they already know. I wear it because my mother gave it to me the last time I saw her, pressed it into my palm without a word and curled my fingers around it. She'd found it somewhere, she said. She thought it suited me. I think she knew more than she ever let on. I think that was its own kind of gift.